Welcome to Season 6 of the Photo Ethics Podcast. I'm your host, Savannah Dodd, and I'm the founder of the Photography Ethics Center. Each week, I'll be talking with an accomplished photographer about the ethics of their practice. This episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast is brought to you by Falmouth University, one of the UK's leading creative arts institutions. If you're a regular listener, you'll know that I'm passionate about education, especially education that is accessible. With flexible online learning through Falmouth University, you can study from anywhere, starting in January, May, or September. Join the university that has nurtured the award-winning photographers Justin Carey, who we interviewed in Season 1, and Rehab El-Dalil, who we interviewed in Season 4. Falmouth graduates have been featured in the New York Times, The Guardian, and the BBC. If you're passionate about photography and want to refine your practice, Falmouth's specialist photography courses are designed for you. Led by expert academics and industry-savvy tutors, you'll develop your critical thinking and create work that explores powerful themes on a local, national, and international scale. Search Photography at Falmouth to find out more. Today, in episode number 6, we'll be talking with Alice Cazenave about the toxicity of photography. Alice Cazenave is a photographic artist and AHRC-funded PhD candidate examining the toxicity of analog film industries. She's creating an alternative archive of film photography's history that foregrounds links between photographic silver extraction and the Anthropocene. She mixes low-toxic photo-chemistries from plants growing in landscapes touched by photographic contamination. Alice's awards and positions include the Ansel Adams Fellowship at the University of Arizona, Artist in Residence at the Hong Kong International Photo Festival, Visiting Scholar in Art and Sustainability at Rochester Institute of Technology, and the Trax Fellowship at Leiden University. Alice is also the research advisor for the Sustainable Darkroom, a charity developing low-toxic praxis in photography. She has exhibited internationally with London Art Fair, Pointsman, Cass Gallery, Halide Project, Center for Creative Photography, BWA Gallery, and Chap Contemporary Art Museum. Artistic features include the British Journal of Photography, The Guardian, and the New York Times. Can we start with you just telling us about the kind of work that you do?
Yes, so I am doing a PhD at the moment that looks at the social and ecological issues with photo industries and photography at large. And I'm also a photographic artist, so I make work that I exhibit in galleries. I'm also working with Sustainable Darkroom, which is a charity that helps develop low toxic practices in photography. So I advise that charity.
And maybe as a starting point for those who might not be aware about like the ecological impacts of analog photography, could you give a overview of sort of what you're looking at and what we're talking about?
Sure. So when I'm talking about the toxicity of photography, I'm speaking about film industries, so analog photography, and thinking about the kinds of chemicals that are involved in making and manufacturing film. It's a really chemically intensive process. So that's the kind of toxicity that goes into the industry. And then I'm also looking at what comes out of the industry, so the contamination and the pollution. And I'm thinking about these things in relation to colonialism, land relations, racial violence, lots of hard topics. So I'm not looking at the environmental impact as separate from social issues and colonial issues. So yeah, there are things that you can do to lower your toxicity when you're making photographs and processing your film. But I'm also interested in the kind of infrastructures that allowed big industries in photography to develop and how they maintained or reproduced different kinds of violence.
And I guess I'd like to know maybe again, for starters, to start us off, thinking about sort of the toxicity of photography, how has that impacted your own practice as a photographic artist? Like, I guess you've learned quite a lot in the course of this PhD research as well about that. I can imagine that that's maybe shaped how you approach your own work.
Yeah, I think initially, before I started doing a lot of the research, I was looking at kind of fixes to lower my toxicity of my practice. So making my own chemistries out of, less impactful materials, or foraging for plants locally and using them to mix my own chemistries to develop film with. And that is a fundamental part of my practice. But I think now I'm thinking more broadly about plants and the way that we can use plants to tell stories about some of the violence and the contamination that's coming out of the industry. So they're not so much kind of practical elements to the work anymore. They're more sort of vehicles to talk about issues with sustainability. So that might be thinking about plants that I can use as a photochemistry to make a photograph, but they also have their own stories. They might grow in contaminated areas, or why do they not grow? What destroyed them? And so using the plants in that way has been more sort of rewarding for me than just lowering the toxicity of my practice. So it's kind of like a way to engage or open up conversations that you wouldn't necessarily be keen to talk about, but the plants have a kind of allure, like people are interested in them. So you can open up these conversations. It's kind of like a gateway rather than just solely using visual imagery. You can use the plants to kind of, add this extra element or narrative to the photographic work that you're making. So I find them really helpful for that. The fact that they're lower toxicity is a happy byproduct of this sort of situation that I'm working with now, which is, storytelling about photographic industries and the spaces they take up through low toxic and plant-based photochemistry.
I really love that, the way that you describe that as well, because I feel like that is just like a different level of engagement or a different layer of engagement with place as well, which seems really relevant to your work, but also to just thinking about anthropology, and your PhD is in visual anthropology. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, it's in visual anthropology, Yeah, I mean, I think using plants to understand place has become like a critical aspect to my work. So I'm making photographs about certain areas that are part of Kodak's history or film photography's history. But the plants really allowed me to understand the literal soil that they were growing out of and how it was contaminated. Or, if I wanted to forage for plants to include to make chemistry from, sometimes I couldn't access those areas. And so really just by learning about a place through foraging for the plants, it really allowed me to kind of engage a bit more than I would if I was looking through a camera, because I felt the fear of going to certain areas that were part of this story. So the act of gathering the photo materials is part of understanding the space that you're documenting through photography.
And when I was looking at your website, it seemed, I can't remember which series it was, but it seemed like you were talking not only about the ecological impacts of photo industries, but also like the sociological impacts of photo industries and the waste on communities. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, so part of the research is looking at kind of where the toxicity that comes out of photographic industries, where it pools and why. And I spent a lot of time up in Rochester, New York, which is the biggest chemical plant that Kodak established, and it was the first industrial site that they had. And I spent a lot of time going to these industrial sites that are now abandoned and thinking about what it's like to be in those spaces, because, there's quite a lot of crime in Rochester. But this was part of my experience of the city, and it was hard to access Kodak Park. Kodak Park is the name of the historical name of the chemical plant. And so I would kind of be going through these neighborhoods and feeling the fear that other people had of them, because people would narrate these spaces as dangerous, people I spoke with. And so you have contamination coming out of the industry that seeps into the literal bedrocks of these neighborhoods. But then you have this secondary kind of damage, which is that people are so afraid to go there, property house prices lower. I mean, it's a huge tangle of a story, but yeah, so accessing Kodak Park and foraging for the plants wasn't always easy, and that was tied up in issues of contamination, but also the segregation in the city and lots of other things that were part of Kodak's story. Because, you know, at the time, it was like the equivalent of living next door to Amazon. It was a huge industry and it had a lot of power in organizing the city. So, yeah, the contamination is pretty severe, actually. A lot of heavy metal contamination. The groundwaters under that industrial site are thought to be so contaminated that it might actually be technically impossible to reverse them to drinking water standards. And then there was a lot of contamination in the river as well. So it's a complex story and it will take many PhDs to get through it, I think.
Yeah, it seems very multi-layered for sure. And like there are a lot of, just different elements to it. And I guess I'm also interested in one sort of element of your PhD, if I understood it correctly, as well. It had to do with like collaborative image making with local communities. And so I guess I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that, because I'm also really curious about how people felt about the characterization of their place as being contaminated.
Yeah, I mean, this was something that I was at the forefront of my mind often. You know, I am working in photography, but this was not my place. This was not my home. I was an outsider coming in. And often I was like quite afraid to approach people because I thought, you know, they're just not going to want to engage in this. And actually, I found that using the plants was a way to kind of unveil the different levels of social and ecological harm that was coalescing in this space without condensing that region to one specific narrative. So using the plants allowed me to kind of build these multiple layers of the sort of benefits to the city and also the more difficult aspects of the city and those difficult experiences that I had. And also juxtaposing things. So, of course, you have lots of contamination, but you also have lots of wealth and mansions. And how do these things speak to each other? You know, two things can be both true at the same time. So it's like, how do you kind of contest with these different narratives that all assemble in the same space at different temporalities? So it's like quite mind-bending work. But I do find that using plants, because they're kind of situated, so they have their own stories. And I think that is a great way for me to kind of bring in all of these different complex threads to a place. So, you know, one example is I was finding it difficult to forage for plants. I wanted to say something about the contamination at Kodak in Rochester, but I was finding it difficult to access these areas to forage for. So I just foraged for plants in my local neighborhood. But these were massive beech trees and oak trees that grow in certain areas of the city. And in other areas, there are no trees. And it's not an accident. They're sort of symbols of wealth. And so the wealthier areas of the city had these kind of avenues of trees. And so I was able to talk about contamination and disparate wealth and the way that it was distributed in the city without kind of honing in on one narrative only. Because, I don't think anyone has the right to enter a space and label it as contaminated or damaged or, you know, hopeless. And I think a lot of the work that I tried to make coming out of Rochester and while I was there, tried to sort of start with that and be like, this is one element of the story, but how can we reframe it or make it more complex so that it's not so condensing.
I think that's a really good point as well about thinking about not just the plants that are available or unavailable in contaminated areas, but the plants that are readily available in wealthier areas. It reminds me a little bit of, I think it's Laura Nader's Studying Up in anthropology. I don't know if you've come across that. But, you know, that idea of sort of focusing your lens on the people with power instead of the people who have less power. And I think that's always a really nice way to sort of turn these narratives on their head and reframe where our focus is.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that was a huge part of my approach in designing the research, actually, because I didn't want to do research that centered on damage. I was interested in sort of looking at the assumptions that we have as photographers, what we know, what we don't know. And I was speaking with Inez Davis the other day, and she put it really well. And she said, it's to kind of look at the ways we're worked on and to kind of unravel the assumptions that we have about our industry and its impact. And I think looking upstream to think about what allowed this kind of violence to happen rather than what's X, Y, and Z contamination status of this, So it was really a case of looking upstream at the infrastructures and the cultural practices around, what we value in photography and what that looks like if you look at the materials that we use. So we might kind of value aesthetically clean or well-balanced photos, but there's a real toxic legacy to making photos that way. So I would say there's a lot of self-assessment in this as well, of like assessing where I stood in all of this. And that's just a constant kind of piece of work, really.
Yeah, I think self-reflection and just that reflexivity point, I think, is always really useful, be it in anthropology or photography or really any sort of practice where you're making something. And did you run into any ethical challenges when you were, I'm thinking specifically about making the photographs for this project or working collaboratively with communities to make images?
Yeah. I feel like I encountered quite a lot of ethical moments where I had to pause and really think. So Kodak established itself on Haudenosaunee land. So Rochester is, a settler colonial town. I was kind of aware of the settler colonial dynamics that allowed photographic industries to establish themselves and dominate and then contaminate the space. So I did end up collaborating with a Haudenosaunee Seneca photographer, and I had spent something like 9 months volunteering at the White Corn Project, which is a food sovereignty project managed by Friends of Ganandagan in Victor, which is right next door to where Kodak started. Yeah, white corn is, I don't want to say too much about the plant itself because I don't really feel like that's my place, but it is a culturally and spiritually significant plant to Haudenosaunee nations and Native American peoples at large. And this is a plant that would have grown extensively and been cultivated with care by Haudenosaunee communities before Kodak arrived. So I didn't really have any intention of making any work necessarily. I think really I was thinking about if a collaboration arose as naturally as it can, then it would be great to do that. So luckily that is just essentially what happened. I was volunteering at the White Corn Project where we sorted the corn and helped basically, it wasn't grown by the volunteers, but it was processed by hand. So taking the corn off the cobs and separating the kernels and then drying it and then cooking it. And part of the cooking of the corn involves soaking it in a sort of lye solution. And I had learned that white corn is a really powerful remediator of pollutants that Kodak was polluting with. So plants can remediate heavy metals from the ground. That means that they take them up through their root systems and they store them in their botanical matter. So they're kind of micro mining at a sort of tiny scale. And they have this sort of inherent capacity to decontaminate spaces. And so I was interested in the fact that this was a plant that would have been growing extensively before Kodak arrived. And so I was just thinking about these different worlds that collide in a single place and the different temporalities. And what we did was, Caleb Fontenelle, the photographer, he took the photograph of the white corn and I did the chemistry side. So I essentially made a plant-based chemistry out of the cooking solution. So the corn was removed. It's not like we were wasting the white corn. This solution was a byproduct of cooking the corn. So we repurposed that and transformed it into a chemistry by just literally adding a bit of vitamin C. And really what I wanted to do was acknowledge Kodak's toxic and colonial history by thinking about this plant and using a less toxic method of creating photographic images. But I also wanted to celebrate the White Corn Project, which is an amazing project coming out of this space. So that was maybe one example of the duality, well, the multiple planes of different kinds of narrative, and not wanting to focus too much on the negativity, but instead celebrate this amazing project and the strength and resilience coming out of it. So that was a great collaboration. And, you know, I'm pleased that I was able to do that, because it felt at the time, it felt important to talk about this, because I think maybe in the past, in the circles that I was in, we weren't talking so much about these more like colonial dynamics that surround photography at like a material level. So the kind of where the materials come from, whose land they're removed from or extracted from, and whose land the industries contaminate. So yeah, just to separate that from thinking about photography and colonialism in terms of like, you know, portraiture or representational starting points. Yeah.
No, I think that's an important distinction, definitely, because, you know, we talk a lot about photography and colonialism in terms of representation, but less about the material aspects of that for sure.
Yeah.
And I really appreciated as well the way that you described sort of your thought process through that project of, you know, how you went about that collaboration and how you situated yourself in that collaboration, but also like down to, you know, when you were making the chemistry, that you weren't extracting the product of white corn. You were using the byproduct, and you were thinking about how to use this project and uplift this project and participate in this project in a way that doesn't extract from it. Does that make sense?
It does. I mean, it's always a delicate dance, really. I think, you know, even if we're using plants, we're still extracting, but, you know, not wasting the corn was paramount. There's absolutely no way I could have made this work and just boiled up the white corn and mashed it up and then used it directly. And also, I think for me, it was important to think about the recycling of things, because I've become really interested in the way that chemicals move through ecologies and the age. They're ancient molecules, you know, they're absolutely ancient atoms. They've been here since the beginning of time. And so, yeah, thinking about how things get recycled in like molecular worlds, repurposing chemicals basically has become really interesting. So when I make a photographic chemistry out of plants and ascorbate, I'll then dehydrate it down to recover some of the raw materials again and remix them. So I'm now also interested in this kind of like chemical recycling, which is tapping into the way that everything is so connected. It sounds so cliche, but chemicals are just the acids that we isolate to make our own chemistry for photography. They may come from plants, but, you know, and we might be using them to create this photograph. But before that, they were hitching a ride in a tree. And before that, they were, you know, somewhere else. And so it's just like fascinating to me the way that these things move around and they kind of shapeshift. So I've been also interested in this sort of recycling and repurposing the actual chemistry to think about the way that contamination moves through time and through people's bodies and through atmospheres and these boundaryless spaces.
And I guess I'm thinking about, you know, other photographers who maybe are interested in learning more about, you know, the acids in the trees that you're talking about, or how we think about waste products and how we can engage with these sustainable practices. And I guess I was wondering if you could maybe point people to some of the resources that have been useful for you. And I'm sure as well, the Sustainable Darkroom is no doubt a resource that you would point people toward. It's a resource that I have definitely taken advantage of many times for my own practice. So it's definitely one we should mention. And as well, if anybody listening is interested in learning more about the Sustainable Darkroom, you can also listen to an episode that we recorded with Hannah Fletcher in season 1 of the podcast as well, which might also have more information for people on this sort of sustainable processes. But yeah, what would you recommend? people?
Yeah, I think, so I'm working in photography, but actually I find the most helpful resources come from outside of my discipline. So I've been looking at research coming from Indigenous science. So Max Liboiron's Pollution is Colonialism is just a wonderful and expansive and really enriching and deep kind of conversation about the seemingly inert or innocuous things that we take part in without realizing it. And I think, yeah, you can read a recipe book about making plant developer. But I think for me, the hard work and the most enriching work comes from like just trying to remove some of your assumptions or at least learn about them. So I find certain scholars really helpful for that. Catherine Yusuf is another one. She's working in urban geography, I think. This is probably not the list that you wanted. Sorry.
No, this is great. This is great because actually, I mean, I feel like that idea of removing your assumptions, like that's so rooted in my experience of anthropology. And it's something that I bang on about all the time. So it's great to have somebody else banging on about that. So, not just me.
I think like the whole reason, I mean, we're talking about ethics, like the whole reason I entered this practice of using plants to talk about photographic industries and their impacts and the dynamics that surround them is because I didn't know anything about it. And that was scary, honestly. And so I think starting to learn small steps in like just educating a little bit about the things that you take for granted, because those things are often violent. I look often to human geography or the social sciences, basically. But then in terms of kind of practical things, the Sustainable Darkroom has a really incredible community of artists that are engaging with lower toxic methods. We have a Patreon that you can pay a small amount per month, and you can access a Discord, which is a platform for sharing recipes and experiments in plant-based and lower toxic methods in photography. And I'm talking about film photography here. So that's one thing. We also have a number of publications which you can buy. We try and make them very accessible in terms of pricing. And you can check out the Sustainable Darkroom website for those. But for me personally, I've found all of that practical help really critical. But I've also tried to put as much focus on undoing some of my own kind of assumptions and really starting with what do I know the least about, or what am I the least comfortable with? What is it that makes me feel really, I'm not sure I understand this. And then that's usually where I do a deep dive. So I found that that's quite helpful.
That's such a useful starting point, I think, for people, because it requires not only us to then take that step to do more research, but it requires that level of reflexivity that's sort of built into the question as well, of sort of saying, where is my knowledge base and where are my gaps? So I think that's really useful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I really enjoy my work, but it's not easy. Like, I don't just love, unraveling all of these things about myself and my assumptions of how I move through this world. Like, it's hard work. And these conversations, I think, that I end up having, I'm still walking very tentatively, and trying to assess like, okay, where's my position in all of this? And how does that impact the work that I'm making? And I'm sure every photographer has that to an extent, because we're storytellers. So, you're of course going to position yourself in the story. But I think it was just really important for me because I knew so little, and that really marked me. Like, I can remember the exact conversation I had with someone where I was like, oh, okay, this is really bad. You need to kind of assess how you understand things now.
No, definitely. And the work that you've made for this PhD research, where do you intend for that to be seen? And have you had an opportunity to maybe bring that back to Rochester?
I would love to bring it back to Rochester. Yeah, I really want to see my friends again that I made out there and who were instrumental in helping me develop this photographic work and PhD work. I think it's really important to have conversations with people about the work that you've made, about where they live and the stories that they're part of. So I think doing an exhibition would be a way to kind of get their insights, and maybe they would illuminate to me, like, I don't think this is that fair, or have you considered this? I would like the work to be a bit more of an open dialogue than a stamping of my thoughts on a place. But inevitably, when you write research and when you make work, you are doing that to an extent. But yeah, I would love to show it through exhibitions, and I definitely don't want it to just be part of the PhD. I think it's very much become, I didn't really know what kind of photographer or photographic artist I was before doing this PhD, and now I feel like I've found the types of work that I want to make. So it will hopefully exist beyond the research, the formalities of writing a thesis and that. Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting thing that you've just said there about that feeling of not really knowing, maybe what your voice is in photography, or what direction, or what feels, most authentic, or the types of stories that you want to tell. And I guess doing a PhD is one very laborious way.
Yes, very long.
Figuring that out.
I mean,
but do you have any advice for anybody who maybe doesn't want to pursue a PhD?
No,
about,
absolutely.
How you can find that for yourself?
Yeah, do you know what? I don't know. I really bounced around a lot from discipline to discipline before I settled in photography. But I do find that those other areas that I focused on are kind of emerging through the work that I do now. So it was never wasted. Yeah, I think like trying different things is an obvious point, but I think it can be really easy to get trapped in what you feel you should do, or what you think is kind of fashionable, or what's kind of on trend. I really think that looking to other disciplines outside of photography and bringing them back in through the work is a really enriching way to engage with the medium, because it explores the complexity of it. It's a really complex medium, photography. I find it fascinating, ethically and materially and historically. So I think it makes sense to kind of explore other areas around photography and not just in lens-based work. But my first degree was in molecular science, and I thought, oh my God, that's absolutely useless for me because I was actually not very good at science. But now I found it super helpful, because I can understand some of the chemicals that I'm working with, and I can understand how they're narrated by scientists and how that impacts how they're treated. So, how are they conceived? Are they conceived as toxic or not? And what is involved in that determination of a chemical? And so all of that's the kind of anthropology, I guess, but having a base in molecular science was super helpful, but not until now. So that took like 10 years to surface. But yeah, what else could you do if you're not sure? I think really just exposing yourself to areas that you know little about has been very helpful for me. and just slowly not being afraid to learn as well, and feeling like, there's a lot of humility in doing this kind of work, and it's a long game. So I think just having a lot of patience. I mean, not everyone has the time, obviously, or the privilege to do a big study. So I'm always grateful for that.
Yeah, I love what you said as well about, staying open to learning. And I think staying curious is something that I think I'm really trying to hold on to quite closely, because I think there's so much to be curious about in the world. And I think, that can keep you maybe more open to learning things and to new ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, everybody approaches ethics differently. But I think for me, I always find it enriching to undo something that was embedded in me, because ultimately you just want to, for me, just want to move through this world in like a kind and respectful way and an informed way. And so, yeah, that was also kind of, I'm not saying, obviously, I've got a lot of work to do, but it's just an approach, I guess. Yeah.
Definitely. I have a slightly unfair question, because I recognize that your area is on analog photography, but I do want to just ask if you could point people to maybe any resources if they're interested in the ecological impacts of digital photography. Where could they go?
Yes. So that's an important point, is that we have this kind of distinction between digital and analog. But actually, when you look at the materials and what's involved in making anything, it involves extraction. So these arguments are kind of applicable to lots of different spheres. Yes, I would say there's a book called Digital Rubbish. It's by Gabrice. Gosh, what's her name? I'd have to look up the author. I think it would be good to look at any kind of scholarship or photography that's dealing with mineral extraction, basically, because it's that kind of metal extractivism that is really at the core of a lot of the social and ecological violence associated with digital technology. And I think we have a tendency to think that digital is non-material because it's kind of ethereal, like it's the internet. What even is the internet? Well, it's actually, at its core, the movement and extraction of metals, among other things. There was a great artist, a duo, a couple of collaborators that made a computer that was powered by coal. So they had burning coal in the gallery. It somehow made the computer work. And I think that was also like a really interesting material connection between the earth and the resources that people take from it and the technology. Is amazing to see it. It's called Coal-Fired Computers. There's also a book, is it Anthony Blum, about the internet and the way that the internet kind of was born in a way from a material perspective. So yeah, those would be my recommendations, but I must admit that I've been doing a deep dive on analog these last couple of years.
No, that's super interesting. And I think that visualization of the coal-fired computers, like I regrettably don't know that much about the electric grid, but I believe that quite a lot of it is still like coal. Right?
I think so. I think so.
And so it's actually, our computers are often fired by coal, but we just don't see it. So it looks clean.
Yeah, right. I mean, with Sustainable Darkroom early on, when we were a smaller charity than we are now, we made a solar-powered website. So we had, in fact, it's on my roof here. It was a website that was powered by a little solar panel. We had a Raspberry Pi, and it had all of the kind of website details loaded onto it. And that was really amazing to see, honestly, just that direct connection between the weather and the earth and what's visible on the internet. It was absolutely wild. I mean, it's not a new idea. Lots of people have made solar-powered websites, but that was one kind of musing that we did to kind of engage in this idea of digital media being really rooted in the earth and the sun, basically.
Oh, that sounds really interesting. And is there anything that I should have asked but didn't?
Oh, I think you've asked really kind questions. I feel like I was able to answer them. I don't think so. No, I feel like we really covered a lot. I hope it made sense.
Okay, good. And then the last question that I like to ask everyone who comes on the podcast is, what does photography ethics mean to you?
For me, it's about starting a project or starting an approach from like a place of feeling vulnerable. So starting to engage with something that you feel vulnerable about, like you don't feel confident necessarily, which might sound a bit counterintuitive. And I'm not saying that people should go and make random work about things they don't understand. But I think just approaching a topic, or at least choosing things that have really marked you from a sense of not knowing too much about them, and that being a problem. I think, yeah, that sort of vulnerability is at the core of all of the work that I've done, really, I would say.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast. The aim of this podcast is to share new insights about photography ethics with others. So if you heard something you liked, please share this podcast with someone who would appreciate it. You can also rate and review us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. This episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast is sponsored by Falmouth University, one of the UK's leading creative arts universities. In a world where images shape narratives, ethical photography has never been more important. At Falmouth University, the online photography MA helps you master your craft while exploring the responsibilities of visual storytelling. Learn from industry experts, challenge conventions, and develop work with integrity, all from almost anywhere in the world. Join a global community of photographers committed to making a difference. Search Falmouth Online and book a call with a course advisor today. Join me next week when we hear from Nana Kofi Akwa about the complexity of consent.